Please join me as we read together from Genesis 1, the creation story. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. As we begin this morning, I invite you to recall a time when you were in awe at the magnificence of the universe. Where were you? Who was with you? And most importantly, what were you wondering about? For me, I think of a time after college when I had moved out to Seattle, and my brother had come out to visit me, and I wanted to show him this amazing place, Puget Sound, and so I took him out to Orcas Island. And to get there, you have to take a ferry. So we took a ferry out to the island, had a wonderful day hiking and exploring that beautiful place. And then we drove back to the ferry dock and realized that we had missed the ferry that we were hoping to catch, which meant that we had to wait for a couple more hours for the very last ferry off the island. And it was growing dark, and it was getting cold, and I didn't have enough clothes with me to stay warm, and I was getting kind of cranky. And my brother said, "You know what? Let's just lie down on the ground and gaze at the stars." And so we did. We lied down on that cold earth and looked up at the stars, and it was an amazing sight because out on the island there aren't a lot of ambient lights, so you can see all the stars that are possible to see from that vantage point on Earth. And I remember lying there thinking, I wonder what is out there. I wonder why all of this exists. I wonder how all of this came to be. And I wonder how God is involved in the universe. Well, I was a chemistry major in college, and so I've always been interested in this connection between science and faith. And for me, the glue that brings and holds the two together is really wonder, because it is wonder that propels the scientists to go study and research with all of those amazing methods and tools that they have. And it is wonder that arises in all of us and propels us to ask those big questions of faith and about God and God's place in our universe. And I think it's helpful as we begin to explore this connection between science and faith in the Genesis stories, to go back in time and try to understand the science of the day when these stories were written. So if you'll bear with me, we're going to take a little detour back into history and think about what did they understand about the world back when these creation stories were written. What did they think they knew about the universe? And it's very different from what we know today. So they believed that the earth was flat and that it was a disk. So it was a flat disk, and that there was a metallic dome that stretched over the earth to keep out all the waters that were up in heaven, because there must be waters up there because the sky is blue, right? And so there's this metallic dome that keeps out all the waters of the heaven. And above that, there's another heaven, the heaven of heavens, they called it. And that's where God lived. And below the earth and around the earth, there was also more water. And so they believed that there were pillars that propped up the earth in the midst of the water and that held up the dome that was creating that nice space called sky. And it wasn't just the ancient Hebrews that had that scientific way of understanding the universe. It was also at that same time the ancient Egyptians and the Canaanites and the Sumerians and many other peoples in the ancient world. So that was their scientific understanding of the universe. And so you can see then how they were moved to write what they did. And so I invite you now to pull out your Pew Bible, and we're going to read just a little bit further into the creation story. So page 1, it says Genesis on the top. So Genesis 1, we're going to read together verses 6 through 8. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. So you can see this process of imagination and wonder at work. You can almost hear the echo in the story of those ancient writers. I wonder what is out there. I wonder why all of this exists. I wonder how this all came to be. I wonder how God is involved in the universe. And you can see their imaginations at work as they begin to formulate some ideas. Imagine if there were 6 days of creation, and on the 7th day, God rested. Imagine if God created life and all the conditions for life by separating those primordial waters and putting in that dome to create the space for earth and for life. And imagine that God looked out at this amazing universe and believed that it was all good. So you can see that process at work in the story. Well, today, in the 21st century, we have a very different understanding of the universe than those ancient Hebrew people. And as we approach this question of how do we connect science and faith, there are 2 options that we have to choose from. So the one is on the right side, and that's to separate scientific knowledge from faith and theology, and to say, you know what, those are really 2 different things, and they're operating with different questions in different spheres, at best. At worst, they're antagonistic towards each other, and there's conflict between science and faith. A different way, though, to approach it, and this is the way I think the ancient Hebrews approached it, was to start with what they thought they knew. So to start with the scientific knowledge of the day, whatever it is, and then through a process of wonder and imagination, to expand out from that knowledge, to imagine how it is that God is creator in this universe. In every age, when there has been a scientific revolution, we see some corresponding struggle between these 2 frames, between these 2 ways of understanding the relationship between science and faith. And we also see, in each age, a theological reimagining of God and who God is in terms of creator in this universe. And this is not new to our own day. If we look back throughout Christian history, this pattern has cycled through several times. So at the time of the early church, when Jesus was on the earth and when the church was starting to form, they no longer believed in the dome and the waters up above and down below. They had a new scientific understanding that they were working with. They thought the earth was a ball, not a flat disk, and that everything else revolved around the earth. So those early Christians were working on their faith and working on understanding God as creator in that period of transition. And then we move forward, jumping into the 16th and 17th centuries. And again, we see a huge revolution in the scientific understanding of our universe. It's not the earth that's in the middle, it's the sun that's in the center, they thought, and everything else is evolving around the sun. And that was a very controversial idea. Most scientists of that day didn't really like it, nor did the church, and it took several hundred years before that concept took hold within the scientific community and within people of faith to really do that work. As the science expands, so too then must our imagination, must our sense of wonder. Well, today we are in the middle of another major scientific revolution that started really in the 19th century and that continues on today, generated by all the wealth of knowledge that we have from quantum physics and genetics and evolution and all of those many scientific fields. And we live in a day where it is possible to know so much more about our universe than we have ever known in the past. And so again, as science, as the scientific knowledge that we have access to stretches out, so too we are invited into that process of imagining and wondering. So as we draw ourselves into the Genesis stories of creation, we have a choice to make as to which approach we want to do. Do we want to do as the ancient Hebrews did and start with what we know and expand out from there? Or do we want to try to separate science and faith? Well, obviously, I'm a proponent of starting with the scientific knowledge and then imagining and wondering and stretching out from there. And that's why I love the piece that we heard through the beginning of worship, because that piece was written by a working scientist who teaches in a Christian college and was confronted with this question of how do we reimagine in our own day the connection between science and faith? And so he composed that beautiful new creation story that we heard this morning. Well, I was just at a conference this winter about this very topic, and I went to a workshop where we walked out into a botanical garden, and the professor who was our guide was talking about the latest scientific discoveries in terms of the origin of life. And he himself is a passionate Christian and follower of Jesus. But he said, as a young Christian growing up, I thought that only a special act from God could account for the origins of life on earth. But he said, science is now telling us something different, that pretty soon we're going to know that life itself can emerge out of non-living systems given the right conditions. And as much science as I've kept up with since graduating with my chemistry degree, I had never heard that before. And it totally blew me away. And I felt like I was thrown back into that moment on Orcas Island, wondering, I wonder what is out there. I wonder why all of this exists. I wonder how all of this came to be. And I wonder how God is involved in this universe. Imagine if God is just one cause among many in the creation of the universe. Imagine if the universe has the capacity for self-creation and God can influence but can't direct the course of history. Imagine if God loves this creation and all that is in it, not because God alone created it, but because God's very essence is overflowing and abundant love. In closing, I want to leave you with one final image. Our theme for the year is animate. Draw yourself into God's story. And as we do that, I invite you to see the creation story in Genesis not as a science textbook, but rather more like a sketch. So the outlines of an amazing story are there for us to engage with. But there's still plenty of room for us to add detail and depth, to add dimension and color. As we together wonder and imagine anew what it means to be Christians and to be in relationship with God faithfully in the 21st century. Amen.